with the shared security responsibility model. So that's a great segue into Aaron, if you want to share your screen now, and we could turn it over to our Trend Micro team to talk about how they go about working with Microsoft, embracing the shared security responsibility model, and making sure that your applications, your data, everything flows smoothly. All right, Aaron, I'll turn it over to you now.
Thanks, Ron. Much appreciated. We at Trend Micro are certainly glad to be here. Certainly happy to support Angel Beats, you, Ron, and obviously very proud and pleased to be discussing our partnership with Microsoft. So without further ado, I'll kind of get into my component. We're actually a little ahead of schedule, which is fantastic. So hopefully I don't go over and stretch this time more for you. But let's talk a little bit about, actually I advanced just a little too quickly. Obviously Trend Micro, security competency partner with Microsoft, available through the Microsoft market, longtime partner here. But one of the things that you might not know about the organization, Trend, is we've been around for 30 plus years. And so we have a lot of, I'll say, legacy, visibility. Remember, we're just talking about visibility or lack of visibility into your organization in the previous session, into what's happened in security just over the past few decades. And so that longevity is relatively rare kind of in the security space. And so one of the things that we do is we aggregate data from our customers and through our partnerships with Microsoft, and we release an annual report, right? This is a very common practice among many of your vendors. But what's great about that, obviously it's sanitized, there's no sensitive information or no specific customer information in there. But what's great about it is that we're able to identify, forgive the pun here, trends, Trend Micro trends, you get it. We're able to identify trends of what's happening across the North America in the breadth of all industry and all verticals as it relates to security. And so lately, just in the past, we'll say decade-ish, right, with the rise of cloud computing, I think 2006, 2008 was kind of where you really saw the genesis of cloud computing and cloud services being launched. A little bit more recently with the Azure platform taking such a wonderful hold on the cloud market, we've been asking and looking at why security or in this sense traditional security is such a challenge to organizations. And it comes down to, this is a perfect baton handoff from the last presentation, it comes down to lack of visibility, and it comes down to a low degree of automation. I don't think it's any secret or anything much of a controversial statement to say that we're overworked. You have too much to do, and odds are your team, you work from 8 to 5 every day, fine. Odds are that at 5 o'clock somebody else on the other side of the country or the other side of the world kind of picks up your work and your duties, or your work just waits for you until you come in the next day at 8 a.m. And you've got change control, and you've got a couple other things that makes it so that automation or automation rather is a challenge at your organization. And the level of human involvement that's needed is high. And you don't have the visibility as to what's happening or what needs to be automated with your organization. And that's tough, right? That makes it hard to act on anything, let alone security, right? When you don't know what's happening and you don't have the bandwidth or the capacity to be able to handle it. A majority of our customers have thousands and thousands of developers and a handful, or if they're lucky, a dozen security architects and cloud architects and InfoSec people. Right, and this is indicative of the trailing edge that security has been just rising in the last decade or so. And so when you've got thousands of developers asking for the resources of a handful, a dozen of security architects or cloud architects or DevOps or DevSecOps people, you have a bandwidth problem, right? And so what you need is, one, those cloud architects to have the visibility into what's happening with the thousands of developers, and two, you need some automation to help support that. I'm not saying automate yourself out of a job or anything like that, but what ends up happening is at these organizations it's one or the other. you either release, don't break the build, promote, you know, and test your code, or you try to release and stay secure, try to build and stay secure, try to promote your code and stay secure. And that doesn't work, right? In today's environment, in today's business, regardless of the vertical that you're in, you have to have moving quickly and staying secure, right? And so that dichotomy that was previously there in the last slide becomes something that's very synergistic in the model that we're going to talk about. And it starts with the fundamental understanding of the Azure Shared Responsibility Model. And you wouldn't think it starts here, right? You would think that I'd be starting with something, some tool set or some software package that can do all this for you. We'll get there. But it actually fundamentally starts with your understanding of the Shared Responsibility Model. What is it that your organization is responsible for when you're building in the cloud? And so obviously Microsoft has a very fantastic documentation portal as it relates to Azure. You can just look up the Microsoft Shared Responsibility Model. You'll come across I think it's a 6 to 9 minute read article that goes through and highlights this. And so what we're looking at here in particular is the component that is, you know, software as a service, right? This left-hand column here. And so what you see is a shifting responsibility, the gray being Microsoft, the blue being the customer. What you see is a shifting responsibility from Microsoft to you, right? And so when you get to identity and access management, when you get to accounts, when you get to the devices that are connecting to something from an infrastructure perspective, when you get to the information or the application that's necessarily being built out there, the responsibility is kind of shifting over to you, and the burden of the protection, the security, and the visibility that you need does and is shifting onto you. So how do you manage that, right? How do you build on that? Well, you can actually dive a little bit deeper and get to the subcomponents of, you know, what those specific responsibilities, right, from a control perspective, are on you. So what this means is that Microsoft, with its millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of implementations of applications in their Azure environment, and you know, those numbers aren't those numbers are assumed. I'm just saying lots. Let's be a little bit less prescriptive. Lots of implementations of applications in their Azure platform and your implementation in its Azure environment. They've seen a lot. They know a lot. They know what best practices are needed in order to set up a successful environment. And you might have a very unique environment. We were speaking to a customer who was trying to set up a call center via Azure, and there were some nuances with the call center software that they were using. Fine, but many people before and many people after have set up call center environments utilizing Azure. And why not take the best practice expertise that's given to you from your partner here in Microsoft? And so you're given this understanding of what burden is put upon you for the protection and for the security that's tied to your infrastructure or the environment that you're putting into Azure. You need to understand that, right? You can't just go into this and think, oh, it's Microsoft, I'm using Azure, they've got a bunch of services, they're going to take care of it. You can't operate under that assumption. And when you understand that, just fundamentally, when you understand that, you're already a leg up and you're already ahead of what needs to be done from a visibility, from a automation, from a compliance perspective. So, you know, full understanding of what onus is on you is very, very important. Now let's put a little bookmark in this, and we're gonna go off on a little trail here to talk about what's been happening with Azure just in general. Right? And this is financial related data, but the point behind this is, one, adoption of Azure is going up, right? It's a hockey stick. If this were my investments, I would love to see this trend in investments, right? So the adoption is going up, right? The complexity is going up. The services are going up, right? Every event, every sort of few months, we're seeing new services, new components that are added to the Azure platform, right? So there are new skill sets needed. right? But what's happening is that, with the complexity, with the increased adoption, and with the new services, there's not necessarily a skills one-to-one parity between what's happening over here, right? So machine learning, automation, all this sort of stuff is coming out over here with the increased complexity of services and the new offerings that are being there. But your workforce and the team that you have that's supporting this doesn't necessarily have the skill set or hasn't been trained to do this. So there's this gap that's happening, right? This is where automation comes into play. The gap that's developed from the employees or the employees' capabilities. I'm not insulting these people. This group of people is catching up and working hard to do so. But the gap that's developed from these employees that's over here and the technology that's just going and going and going and going is widening, right? And that's where you need to start to think about relying on automation and other technologies to help fill that gap so that your understanding and the environment that you're building within Azure is secure, is compliant, and highly visible. So jumping back into the sort of shared responsibility model, good news, Microsoft gives you a guidebook, a playbook almost, to say, hey, when you're building in our environment, you need to follow these 5 pillars, these 5 tenets to do and build correctly. And so not only are you now partnering with Microsoft, not only are you now building your environment out in your Azure and using the services, and using the services that are provided to you, fantastic. Now you understand that there's an onus on you or a burden on you to make certain that this environment is secure and compliant. But the person, the entity that's done millions, lots, right, of implementations here also gives you a roadmap to follow to say, hey, here's what we've seen. Here are the best practices that we've seen on all the implementations that we've done, and it's called the Azure Well-Architected Framework. And it's broken up into these 5 different tenets. I'm not going to read them to you. You can read them. But each tenant has a subset of the services that are tied to them, as well as some best practice recommendations on how to adhere to them. So to us at Trend Micro, obviously that security one's pretty important, but the good news is we take all of these and we help you map to them with that automated software component that I was aforementioned in my discussion piece. So, but beyond that, I mean, you can sit here now and say, okay, as I'm building out my Azure environment, I understand that there's a burden on me to build this environment correctly, to build this environment in a compliant fashion, and to build this environment in such a way that it's secure. Microsoft, why don't you tell me how to do this? Oh, here you go. Here are the 5 tenets that you can use to correctly build your environment, right? And so you can go and obviously if this was hyperlinkable, you could click on each of these and see these. Again, all of this is available in Azure's documentation, but you can build out the environment so that it's efficient, so that it is reliable, so that it is cost efficient, right? Microsoft's not trying to nickel and dime you on everything. And if you build an environment that's inefficient, your blobs are too big, your SQL Server is misconfigured, your compute is overpowered, right? You're going to be wasting money. You're going to be wasting thousands of dollars on something. And so they work with you to even save you money as part of this. So how wonderful is it to have a partner in Microsoft that also saves you money, makes you secure, makes you efficient and reliable, and all these things. And so if you haven't, if you're in the stage where you're considering a build out or a migration to Azure, you owe it to yourself to, 1, understand the shared responsibility model, but 2, really study and get an in-depth understanding of the 5 tenets of this framework, so you're doing this. If you're in the midst of a migration or you've done a migration and you're born in Azure and you're kind of building out, it still doesn't mean that this isn't applicable. As a point of fact, that top one might be most applicable to you because odds are you've got some inefficiencies in the way that you've built out the environment that you're utilizing. And so let's take a look at okay, fine, you say that the shared responsibility model is important. Great, there are these 5 tenets of the well-architected framework. How are we doing? As a business or as an enterprise, how are we doing with relation to implementations of cloud or Azure services? Well, Answer is not so good. And the prediction is that it could be even worse, right? And so, Trend Micro says this. Microsoft probably has a statement about this. Gartner comes out and says, hey, you're not, the number one issue, security failure, is going to be misconfigurations in kind of your cloud environment. And so we'll get to this slide or the build out of this slide and why it's important a little bit later, because you'll see this as kind of a constant theme within my presentation. But just at a high level, and I had one other point here. It's great that we say it. It's great that Microsoft says it. It's great that Gartner says it. The NSA also says it. So if you didn't see, in about January, the NSA released a paper to all the federal agencies of which they serve, including us as citizens of this country. The NSA released a paper in January of this year that said the same thing, the exact same thing, that cloud misconfigurations and issues within clouds and breaches will be customer misconfiguration issues, and poorly built out cloud environments. Full stop. So it's great when we say it. It's great when your vendors say it. It's great when your partners say it. When a three-letter agency says it, you should probably pay attention. So completely, everybody is telling you and saying to you that, hey, this is going to be bad, and it's probably going to be your fault when you do it. But let's talk a little bit at a high level. We'll get back to this as to what happens. So you're all familiar with don't breaking the build, the golden path, the way in which our code is developed, and there, like I said, there's thousands of people over here that are developing. They're promoting and building their environments, and they're pushing out to the cloud. But what ends up happening is when you make a mistake here, it ends up huge over here, right? If you're building a car and you need to change a screw over here after the car's already been built, it's a lot more costly and expensive to change the screw all the way down here. Also, it's much more impactful when the car's already done versus when you're building the car. Well, the same sort of mentality can be applied here. When you're building an application, it's much more efficient and having the visibility on it earlier on than having to deal with it when something's been put into production. This was a principle that was actually defined by NASA in the 1970s. There's a great article that NASA and many people have studied that's on it, talking about building a spaceship. And so the analogy is kind of like a screw, right? If you're going to build the spaceship, when you have to fix a screw here versus fixing it on the launch pad, two completely very different issues. And this is kind of common knowledge. I'm not necessarily going over something that's rocket science. But what ends up happening, let's take what we've already done, right? There's a skills gap, right? There's a gap between the technology and the teams that are supporting this. There's a visibility gap. We're not able to see what's happening with what's being promoted and built into the environments. People are using scratch pads and sandbox environments. We're not monitoring those, and those get built and promoted up. Or people are using infrastructure as code and templates, right? Ansible, Terraform, whatever in your Azure environment, and you're not monitoring that. That was something that was downloaded off the internet or 2 years old and hasn't been updated, right? Gap. And that environment that you're building out is insecure, uncompliant, or misconfigured at a minimum, right? And so what are we seeing from a misconfiguration standpoint? Remember, I said we've been doing this for a very long time, operating the cloud for a long time, and so we're seeing a consistent set of issues. Well, the good and bad news is that the issues that we're seeing aren't necessarily news per se, right? We've always had issues with identity and access management, issues with keys and the rotation of access of keys, issues with validation and permissions and those sorts of things. So those have been application issues since the OWASP top 10, kind of was available. I mean, that's more of an attack and an injection sort of thing, but the issues that are the root causes of those things have been around forever, right? And so again, good news, bad news, right? We're seeing the same sort of things compounded time and time again. And they lead to time and time again issues. And so what I wanted to do was not necessarily use this as a wall of shame, but just validate that, hey, you've heard of these breaches, and you've heard of popular, I'll say, misconfigurations already. Odds are there are many of which you haven't heard, but misconfigured cloud leads to this, right? Misconfigured cloud leads to this. Lack of visibility, lack of automation, skills gap, failure to understand the 5 tenets of the great architecture, failure to understand the shared responsibility model, leads to this time and time and time again. And according to Gartner, according to NSA, according to Trend Micro, probably according to Microsoft, I'm not speaking for Microsoft here, but it's going to happen again, right? And so you need to have this understanding and this visibility into what's going on. And every application that you build is different. It's got a different storage. It's got a different middle tier. It's got a different, application layer that supports it. You might be using a different database technology that uses and leverages that. So regardless, right? Regardless of the journey that you're using to make your application from here to here, right? You're going right along this diagram. Regardless of the stack that you're using to build it, you have to have that understanding and that visibility and the automation to be able to configure it correctly. So, going back to this slide, right? I told you that we'd come back here. So let's talk a little bit about what ended up happening, right? When you have an issue on the left-hand side in the earlier parts, when you're misconfiguring something, when you're not doing something correctly, let's ask, when you've got a DevOps team, a developer that's building the blob storage or the SQL Server database for your organization, do you think that developer has the same expertise as a storage specialist or as a database architect? It's a rhetorical question. Obviously they don't. The reason that you have a storage specialist and a database architect at your organization is because they have the specialty to do it. And she knows everything about databases, and she knows everything about encryption and storage and configuration of storage, right? But when you've got the developer that's just building out the Azure environment and clicking and adding services and nexting and launching, you miss that, right? You don't have that visibility that's part of that build cycle. And what ends up happening when you have that is you have issues that are accessed in the repository. You've got file storage issues. You've got PKI, or I'm sorry, in this case is, access keys that aren't necessarily rotated efficiently, right? And I actually loaded this slide up backwards. I wanted the CloudFormation template piece to be last, but nothing like testing in production, right? So we have all these operational challenges here. So you get the compounding of the failure to understand and the failure to build properly. And I'm beating a dead horse here, right? You understand and you know where this is going. And it ends up leading to all sorts of issues. I think the cherry on top of this is when you're using a software-defined infrastructure or an infrastructure as code sort of set up in your environment, and you're not you have no visibility into that template. It's 2 years old. It's not necessarily relevant to the unique journey. Let me go back. It's not, the template that you're using isn't necessarily relevant to the unique journey that your application has, right? You're just going to lead yourself to all sorts of issues. So what you need, right, is central visibility, real-time monitoring. What you need is automation. What you need is the guardrails. What you need is the built-in components to DevOps. Now, here's the secret here. You don't want to do this in such a way that it's a speed bump or even a gate, a swim lane like with a gate for your build process. You want to build this in such a way that it is already and automatically accepted from a developer standpoint. So what we do with our customers is that we build this and integrate this into the way in which they develop. So example, maybe you're using a Jira ticket or a ServiceNow ticketing system to do your development. We'll weave in the security findings, the compliance findings, the visibility, and the automation into that Jira system. So when developer sits down into their IDE or into their desk every day to do their work, they just get a ticket that's identified as a bug. They coordinate that bug with the build coordinator. They squash the bug, and they keep developing. And they have no idea, well, they do, but they have no idea that ticket necessarily came from security, and the security architect isn't monitoring a separate queue, and they're not, coming over the top and trying to see what's happening with the build coordinator. No, it's just all taken care of the same way that the methodology and the development happens at the organization. And when you weave it in that way, you're not doing it in secret, but you're weaving it in such a way that security is just another bug and something else that just needs to be squashed before the build gets promoted. And that's where you get to fast and secure. And that's really what you want to get to. So when you do this, it's no secret that you're getting to a much, much more acceptable risk posture. We're not promising zero risk, we're promising managed risk, right? So when you manage your risk appropriately, you're doing it in such a way that is quickly ramped up, and quickly you have that visibility to report and secure on this. And so what another bonus or sort of, I'll say, I won't necessarily say business need, it depends on your business, but I'll say is definitely a bonus as you're building this out is when you can make it compliant, right? So if you can tie or align the best practices of the framework to a compliance framework, you're adding there, and you're making something that it's even more seamless and even more beneficial, that provides more value to the organization, right? So you're building fast, you're building securely, and you're building with compliance. Tell your auditor that comes in that, yeah, my cloud environment is compliant as of this second, because you're scanning and constantly monitoring those builds and constantly looking at the dynamic Azure environment that you have there. And so this is what I was talking about when I said weave it into the methodologies and the practiced approach in which your developers develop, so that you can kind of build it into that. So where does I have 2 slides or maybe 3 slides that are specifically to Trend Micro. So where does kind of the Azure shared responsibility model and the 5 tenets of the framework end, and where does Trend Micro kind of begin? Well, the good news is we augment. We're not replacing anything that you have with Azure. We want you to use Security Center. We want you to use the services and the compliance frameworks that are provided there. What we'll do is we'll integrate into the already existing technology pipeline that you have, and put our actions into those steps, right? And so we can utilize our scanning technologies to build into various steps of your development pipeline, and make this so that it's continuous, and make it so that you have that visibility, so that you are operating fast and secure in a seamless way that builds on top of the existing Azure services that you're already using. So remember, we're not talking about replacement or anything like that. It's a crawl, walk, run methodology, where you crawl with the understanding of the framework and the shared responsibility model and the well-architected framework. You walk with your usage of Security Center. You run with our technology that builds on top of it, right? And so here's that slide again, right? Or here's that diagram again that I constantly show, right? When you have that visibility and the real-time access to something, you're building in the 2 points that we identified as part of the issue, right? You have the visibility into what's happening, and then you have the ability to automate what's happening there. And so when you identify that problem and you remediate it, you've instantly kind of taken care of a lot of problems that would fall off that binary tree. So last slide kind of on Trend Micro, the piece that I'm talking about here is the conformity piece, the misconfiguration monitoring piece that we build and weave in. It's part of our overall cloud platform that covers all sorts of gamuts, the gamut of your cloud environment. If you want to learn more, we have free resources that are available to you. No dollars exchanged, able to plug in and utilize, and Ron has these slides. So all these hyperlinkable links that are here. We'll partner with you and do free work for you. We'll give you free access to our solution set. We want to be community minded. All right, thank you for your time, everyone. Hope you enjoyed this session, and back to you, Ron.
One of the questions just came up, and maybe we still have a few minutes to answer this question, Aaron, and I know the answer is yes, but maybe you could expand upon this. Does Trend Micro Cloud One have security compliance features? Maybe you could answer that, Aaron?
Sure, yeah, absolutely we do. If I go back to one of my slides here, and this is where we have a whole slew of different compliance standards that we'll map to. Good news is in Security Center, you also have this as well. So again, we augment and build on top of these components. And yes, we have the capacity to adhere to various standards that have been approved by those governing boards themselves. So, you can you can put a bunch of rules and checks and automation out there and say, hey, it maps to the CIS benchmarks, but you actually have to go to the CIS council and get approval to put kind of that golden seal that's on this. And so, yes, we've got a bunch. This is not indicative of everything that's there, but there's quite a few standards in which we adhere to and map in our Cloud One offering. And so depending on which wedge of that, let me go back to that slide, depending on which wedge of that pie that you're looking at, we can walk you through, which one is which. But absolutely.